but it's going to be a much worse crisis. And in fact, what's happened right now with COVID-19, that's not the problem. I mean, I'm not going to diminish the fact that, yes, there is a health threat there. That's a problem. But the economic problem is not COVID-19. What's really the problem is the bubble. Everybody wants something for nothing from the government. I mean, that's the type of nation that we have now. People are looking for a handout. People think they're entitled to stuff simply because they exist. The only thing you have a right to is your freedom. You have a right to be left alone so you can pursue all the things that you want. You can pursue property, you can pursue happiness, but you don't have a right to any of those things because you don't have a right to take things away from other people. And in fact, I think the air was coming out of the bubble anyway. And so what happened was COVID just put a gaping hole into a bubble that was already leaking air. And so now the air has come gushing out. But I think that the financial collapse that I had been warning about for a decade is now much closer because of COVID-19. But because we succeeded in kicking the can down the road for a decade, the crisis is now going to be much bigger than the one that I contemplated back then. I think the dollar's demise is going to be far greater. I think the probability of actual hyperinflation is higher now than it was then. So I think the stakes are higher. I think ultimately the profits that people will make betting against the dollar, betting on gold-related equities, and basically avoiding U.S. assets, I think the profits are going to be a lot bigger now as well, because it's a bigger bubble. A lot more air is going to come out. That means a lot more gain for the people who are properly positioned. Well, people seem to be under the impression that governments just have this pile of money and that, normally they're kind of stingy with it and they don't want to share it with the people. But then, when there's a crisis, there's an emergency, all of a sudden they become more generous with this money and they just dole it out. And oh, this is great. The government's going to help us. Now we're going to get all this extra money, and that's going to replace the money I'm no longer earning because I'm not working, I'm not productive. But it's okay. The government's just going to share this windfall with me. And this is all a bunch of nonsense. The government doesn't have anything, right? The government doesn't produce. They're not providing goods and services. All they do is print money, right? The central banks create money. And what money does, when you're talking about fiat money, right? Currency that's backed by nothing, just currency that central banks literally conjure out of thin air, right? That money in and of itself has no value. What happens is the people that have that money can use it to buy the goods and services that the market is providing. And so the more money in circulation, the higher the price of those goods and services. So when the government creates money and gives it to people, when those people who get the money spend it, they're simply buying something that other people can no longer afford because the price went up, right? The government isn't adding new production to the economy. It's just adding additional claims to the existing stock of production of goods and services. So it isn't a windfall, right? The government cannot support the people. It's the other way around. The government only has the resources it takes from the people. The people support government. Government can't support the people. Now, can the government support some people at the expense of others? Yes, the government can take from Peter to pay Paul, but that means Paul has lost something in order for Peter to get something. This is all going to end in tears because all we're doing is creating inflation. We are destroying the value of money in order to print more of it and to, distribute it. But, what we're getting now is more money, but less stuff, because people who used to be employed productively, producing goods and providing services, are now sitting at home. And instead of getting paid for their contribution by their employer, they're just getting money for nothing from the government. They're putting nothing in, but they're getting checks to take something out. And so we're all going to be trying to bid for a diminished supply of goods and services with newly created money. And it's just inflation. But the problem is going to be greatest in the United States because we are printing more than anybody else. And I think that the dollar is going to lose its status as the reserve currency. We're going to have a dollar crisis, and the dollar is going to lose a tremendous percentage of its value, much more so than other fiat currencies. And it's going to mean a complete collapse in the American standard of living. Well, first of all, it's the tip of the iceberg because that is only the Treasury debt that's outstanding. So that's bonded, funded debt, where the government has borrowed money and issued a formal IOU in the form of a Treasury security. But those are not the only debts that the U.S. government is obligated to repay, right? If you look at all of the debt that we're on the hook for, right, the unfunded liabilities, and then if you look at a lot of debt that the U.S. government has guaranteed, there you're talking about like $150 trillion. So you're talking about a number that is more than 5 times greater than the official national debt that we're talking about when you're talking about this $26 trillion. But to put that $26 trillion in perspective, that's about 8 years of the current tax revenue, right? That's 8 years of taxation to repay that debt, which obviously shows you that the debt is completely unrepayable. There's no way to do that because that's 8 years of tax revenue where the government spends nothing on anything else, which is impossible. The government can't spend zero in order to repay its debt. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP, right now we're at about 120% of GDP, the size of that debt. But of course, American taxpayers are also on the hook for the debts of the state and local governments. So when you add on those debts, I think the total claim on GDP by government on all levels is more like, I think, about 140%, but it's escalating quickly. In fact, right now, the US government is borrowing more money than it raises in taxes. I think almost 52 cents of every federal dollar spent has been borrowed. I mean, think about that for a minute. This is how the US government is running itself, not on taxation, but on debt. And of course, the Federal Reserve is buying probably all of that debt. So the government is already running itself with a printing press rather than through legitimate taxation. The only reason that we appear solvent is because the average cost to fund the national debt, the interest is 1.5%. And so because we're only paying 1.5% interest on 26 trillion of debt, it looks like the debt is affordable. But if interest rates were to ever normalize, I mean, forget about interest rates being high. Remember in 1980, they went to 20%. But, even if they went to 5% today, you would be looking at spending more in interest than we do in Social Security. In fact, we'd be spending more on interest than Medicare. It'd be the biggest line item in the budget. And in fact, if interest rates went to about 5%, about 40% of every tax dollar